Carson Center and the Deutsches Museum for the friendly reception. I'm very glad to have this opportunity as a Carson Fellow to present my research to the public and my colleagues. So, I welcome everybody to my talk, which is entitled Imaginations of the Perfect Human-Ocean Relation. Give me half a tanker of iron and I will give you an ice age. The American oceanographer John Martin is remembered primarily for this phrase, which came to him spontaneously during a lecture at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in the year 1988. For decades, he had been exploring the basic nutrients in the sea that regulate the growth of phytoplankton and zooplankton. These tiny, freely drifting organisms owe their name to the Greek word for wandering, because they travel with the currents. Although these organisms are minuscule, thousands can be found in even a single drop of water, and the total mass of phytoplankton is estimated at 1,000 billion tons. They form the base of the food chain for all other oceanic organisms, whether zooplankton, fish, or whales. Being photosynthetic, they take up the carbon dioxide dissolved in the water, building the carbon into their cells and releasing O2. Approximately 50% of the oxygen that we breathe stems from this process. That is why the ocean is also called the lungs of the planet. What John Martin had in mind when he made his remark on the iron and ice ages was the fact that plankton depends not only on sunlight and macronutrients, but also on micronutrients such as iron. The proposal then was to drop iron sulfate upon a defined area of the ocean and see whether that would speed up the growth of phytoplankton. The really appealing part of the phytoplankton iron question was indeed its linkage to the global carbon cycle, and therefore its implications for the problem of global warming. So we could say that Martin was offering a very simple image or an imagination of an optimized human-ocean relation. By dropping iron onto the oceans, phytoplankton growth would increase and so would take up more carbon dioxide, the primary mechanism of the global greenhouse effect. These kinds of imaginations linked to the marine biomass, whether phytoplankton or zooplankton, are what form the backbone of my planned book on the history of plankton research, with its working title, Plankton, An Environmental History of Oceanic Biomass, 1850 to 2020. When I began to explore the history of plankton research in the highly industrialized countries, it struck me that these watery organisms have always been the targets of big questions and were equally supposed to deliver solutions to massive problems. The hopes for what might be found out scientifically or for what problems could be tackled by proper management of plankton, as well as the fictional utopias and dystopias connected to algae, or what lent the book its place in chronological order. Just to mention the most important questions within this history. What is the origin of life? What is the metabolism of the sea? Can we feed and pacify the world through plankton? What if algae took control? Is plankton a solution to the energy problem? Will plankton rescue us from global warming? In the time period covered by the book, the biological material has remained always the same, while the hopes projected upon it have changed in relation to the changing historical context in Western countries. What explains the huge imaginary potential of plankton? The answer to this is twofold. First, the ocean is huge. Roughly 70% of the planet is covered by ocean. It holds 97% of the world's water mass and provides the largest living space. Just to give you an idea of its extent, we know, for example, that the Pacific Ocean spans almost 1/3 of the Earth's surface. All the world's other oceans could fit into it, as could all land masses of the world. It is with good reason that we talk of the blue planet, but only 5% of the oceanic world has yet been explored. High pressure, low temperature, the absence of oxygen, and the profound darkness beyond about 100 fathoms all mitigate against direct access to the deep ocean. Human beings are scarcely able to explore this remote space by themselves and must supplement or substitute their physiological condition to approach it. Deep oceans share this characteristic with outer space. As a consequence, as the historian Helen Rozwadowski puts it, our human experiences of the deep ocean are always mediated through technologies, knowledge systems, or cultural conceptions of this space, or some combination of these. As a corollary of this, Rozwadowski assigns imagination an outstanding role in connection to our knowledge of the oceans, seeing it as just as essential as technology or scientific practice, and indeed the two exert a powerful mutual influence on each other. Secondly, the materiality of plankton itself fuels our imaginations. It takes on all manner of forms, among which there are fascinating ornamental structures, while of the thousands of different species, there are many which remain essentially unknown to us. When a single pelagic organism is taken out of its watery environment, it is very difficult to keep alive. Scientists have struggled with the fact that they cannot study the organism's anatomy or color because the single plankton organism immediately loses its characteristics once caught in a net. They quickly die and fade, the marine scientist Alistair Hardy stated, and made a huge effort to draw the creatures directly while on his ship. In comparison, when taken as a marine moss, we observe that plankton reproduces very quickly, renewing itself some 45 times per year. The dark side of the fast growth is the phenomenon of algae blooms, where the plankton reaches a critical mass, absorbing all nutrients in the space and causing so-called death zones. The contradiction between the scientific fascination of the blooms and the destruction they cause feeds our greed as well as our fears, and raises questions of control or optimum use. These promises of perfectibility accompany all imaginations related to the life cycles of plankton. In my book, I aim to show how the hopes and dreams clinging to that biological material have been informed by the changing historical context, and how we, through looking at the different scientific, technological, and cultural practices related to plankton, can discover how the human-ocean relation has been imagined and how it has changed over time. Just to give you an idea about some of the periods in plankton research, let me mention two examples before I come back to Martin's case. The German marine biologist Victor Hansen, who led a famous expedition on plankton research at the end of the 19th century, coined the name plankton and gave us the metaphor of the blood of the sea for the pelagic creatures. This metaphor was influenced by his training as a physiologist, and it signals what he suspected to be the function of plankton in the sea, namely an ubiquitous resource providing all the other organisms with food. And that included human beings, because by counting pelagic organisms, Hansen aimed to answer why the fisheries of Prussia were in decline. So by investigating what he called the metabolism of the sea and revealing the distribution of the blood of the sea, he was also investigating the prosperity of the food chain on land. Another example in the history of plankton research stems from the 1950s and 60s, when phytoplankton was thought to promise an endless food resource directly for humans. That idea was deeply rooted in the dreadful experiences of World War II, in which millions of people suffered malnutrition. Scientists in America, Europe, and Japan cultivated a species of freshwater algae, chlorella, which was thought of as a photosynthetic wonder machine that would grow, economically speaking, on, I quote, less than nothing, that is, on water and sunlight alone. The historian Bart Belasco has shown how these projects to feed and pacify the world through providing everybody with algal protein were a perfect fit for the atomic age. No dirt, no sweat, no heat. Only a highly technical atmosphere in a clean and controllable space managed without huge demands on manpower. Popular magazines eagerly promoted the idea, telling us that such a small, virtually invisible thing like phytoplankton might end up as a substitute for burgers. Let them eat kelp, Fortune declared in 1956, ending the article with a laconic, "Will somebody pass the ketchup?" Yet, as Velasco shows in detail, by the end of the 1960s, the industrial algae project had failed, and this was in part for reasons of culture. Western consumers, not used to the so-called Asian diet, simply would not eat it. Whereas the project turned out to be very expensive because industrially cultivated chlorella did not, after all, grow with less than nothing, and the science required astronomical amounts of energy. Not to mention the fact that chlorella did not behave as expected. It did not yield the desired amounts of protein, and the human intestine had to work hard to extract what there was from the algal cells. The idea of cutting out the marine food chain and linking phytoplankton directly to the human gut transpired to be a failure. Let us now return to Martin in 1988. In that offhand comment, "Give me half a tanker of iron and I will give you an ice age," he projected our imaginations of an optimized human-ocean relation into a new context, that of global warming. The idea was to throw iron sulfate from ships onto the surface of a select part of the ocean, thus stimulating phytoplankton growth. The phytoplankton would then increase their consumption of the carbon dioxide dissolved in the water, and then when they died, or were eaten by predators which died, that carbon would be deposited on the ocean floor in their corpses. The rationale behind these experiments in ocean fertilization was that it would enhance a natural process that is going on anyway, this being the so-called biological pump, the transfer of CO2 into the depth of the ocean by means of organisms. As Martin believed iron to be a limiting factor on plankton growth, the experiments were designed to evaluate the iron hypothesis. Martin, however, would not live to evaluate his hypothesis since he died in 1993, only a few months before his colleagues ran the first experiment. For various reasons, they chose a patch of ocean near the Galapagos Islands, and iron was scattered over a surface area of about 65 square kilometers. The first experiment, it turned out, provided no results at all, because unexpected currents in the seeded patch pulled the chemical down out of the sunlit zone. The next attempt did show an immediate greening of the corresponding area, but only for a short period of time, approximately 3 to 4 days. This pattern would repeat itself over the many other ocean fertilization experiments that were run in the 1990s and the following decade. So, what happened? First of all, the zooplankton was delighted by the algae bloom and devoured it before the phytoplankton could reproduce further. The other reason why the blooming stopped so quickly was that the fast growth of the phytoplankton, stimulated by the iron, exhausted other nutrients in the area, that in turn became a limiting factor. These two phenomena did indeed confirm the original iron hypothesis, that the addition of the metal would increase plant growth, but how much carbon dioxide was sequestered during that process remained unanswered. And here the whole thing becomes even more complicated. Carbon dioxide is only stored if it reaches the coldest layers of water. In the first 200 meters of the ocean, it remains in contact with the atmosphere, and differences in pressure between the water and the air cause the carbon dioxide to travel between the two levels. Sequestration requires that the carbon sink to the seafloor with the organisms when they die, be it phytoplankton itself, the zooplankton, or bigger organisms that feed on zooplankton, as well as their excrement. This is the process known as marine snow. But phytoplankton being very lightweight, that trip to the ocean floor would take up to a century to complete. And it turned out that the dead plankton bodies were also decomposed by bacteria during that journey, whereupon the captured carbon dioxide was released once again. In order to speed up the process, the experimenters turned to areas frequented by bigger phytoplankton species heavy enough for a quick descent. Yet this fix brought new problems, because some of the heavier species are toxic and cause partial dead zones. These were not only bad for the local ecosystem, but also gave the ocean surface a greenish tinge, decreasing its reflectivity, or albedo, whereupon it became warmer, and warmer layers of water, of course, capture less carbon dioxide. Finally, to confuse the issue even more, the up and down wellings of oceanic water remain barely understood. Our case study of ocean fertilization presents us with an imagination of an optimized human-ocean relation, which then collides with the reality of dozens of entangled marine ecosystems with complex biological, physical, and chemical conditions, all in a state of dynamic interaction. No significant success in carbon dioxide sequestration was demonstrated by the experiments that were run between 1993 and 2004. And it was concluded that large-scale interventions would have counterproductive effects on the ecosystem. In 2008, ocean fertilization experiments were banned by the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. Some dreams die hard. Remember that simple model? The article from which this image is drawn was published as recently in 2018 under the title "Iron fertilization of the ocean is as natural as whale poop and it can save the planet." Yet the reality is as least complicated as this illustration shows. You may be alarmed then to learn that the idea of solving climate change by ocean fertilization still persists. This brings me to a final evaluation of the case study and to my conclusion. Ideas of large-scale intervention or geoengineering methods are today gaining new ground. In line with the recent transition from talk of climate change to climate emergency, some are tempted to seek emergency responses. The case study of ocean fertilization reminds us that the idea of enhancing the biological pond is deeply rooted in the mechanistic thinking of the industrial age. The essential biological part is reduced to a physical carrier within a hydraulic machine. And we here detect a dream of the technological fix, that a group of scientists and experts will take control and solve all the problems of the world on our behalf. The methods of geoengineering are frequently criticized, and with good reason. Their axiom is not to avoid emissions, but rather to respond to the carbon dioxide that is already present. Generally, large-scale interventions in such global commons as the ocean or the atmosphere are seen as undemocratic and redolent of a tradition of Western colonial thinking which neglects regional differences in societies, ecosystems, landscapes, and practices. The ocean as we know it today bears the memory of the industrial age, not least because it contains an estimated 30% of the anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions, with dramatic consequences such as warming, acidification, and the dying off of coral reefs. But only 1 to 3% of the stored carbon dioxide is definitely mineralized and sequestered on the sea floor. Over the next 1,000 years, the rest of it will be brought back to the surface by obolings and currents. What seems like a comfortable time period for our generation is a very short period of time from a geological perspective. The historian Deeply Chakrabarty has pointed to that gap in his reflections on the age of the Anthropocene, emphasizing that planetary time is not historical time. And the biggest task we must undertake in facing the planetary crisis of global warming is to make political time responsive to planetary time. Because if not, the best we can hope for is perhaps an adaptation of Martin's phrase. Give me, say, half a million years, and I will give you an ice age.